Hear now this reading from the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, the lectionary reading for this Sunday, beginning at the first verse of Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here am I." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked together. Isaac said to his father, to Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place God had shown, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here am I." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of God shall stand forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Grant, O Lord, that we might be the masters of ourselves to become the servants of others. Take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire for Thee. Amen. Well, as you just heard, the Old Testament reading for today is what I consider to be one of the most disturbing stories in all the Bible. Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, his son, up on Mount Moriah. Walter Brueggemann, Old Testament scholar, says this is one of the more challenging passages he has ever come across in all of literature. And I am convinced that whoever chooses these passages for the lectionary has at least something of a mean streak in them, because they pick this passage to come up every 3 years. And I don't know why, but the timing I noticed, I looked back, and the last time it came up was late June, and the time before that it came up on Father's Day. What a passage. What a passage for Father's Day, my goodness. But up until now, mean streak or no, I have always gotten the last laugh on those lectionary authors, because I suspect the vast number of my ministerial colleagues across the country deal with this text in the same way. We just avoid it. You know, we say nothing about it. Pick something more manageable and more pleasant to talk about on a summer Sunday, and we just ignore it and go on. I mean, who could like this story? Poor Isaac being led to what appears to be, for all intents and purposes, his ritual demise at the hand of his own father and at the suggestion of God himself. who could like this? I mean, what kind of a God would suggest that? And what kind of father would even consider carrying that out? And while we're asking questions of this little story, what kind of son who is at this stage of his life, we know from the passage, big enough and strong enough to lug all of the wood on his back up the mountain, doesn't make a break for it, when he sees this happening, and at least try to get away. In some ways, I have to say, this is the kind of story that tends to give religious skeptics ammunition. When people go on a rant about religion and why they're not religious, this is the kind of passage they're likely to talk about. I mean, who wants to be guided, they will say, by a book which promotes even the idea of contemplating the sacrifice of a young man to pass some theological test or make some theological point? Can't you hear that? I could imagine somebody saying that. And all of that was running through my mind as a kind of a generalized worry on Monday when I started thinking about it. I was tempted to avoid it again, I will tell you, and make this, what it would be my 11th, the cycle is every 3 years, so it would be the 11th time I've avoided it in 33 years. But, I started to mull it over, and the first thing that I did notice about the story is that, and it gave me a little bit of comfort, is that it's only 14 verses of a much larger story of Abraham, right? I mean, the story of Abraham takes up a big hunk of the book of Genesis. And so in that bigger context, one of the things that I think is worth saying is that this little theological test section only occurs in the context of a much larger and enormously positive story of Abraham and Sarah. I mean, taken as a whole, the story of Abraham is one of the earliest known pieces of literature that is rooted in promise and hopefulness and this great idea that whatever your age or station in life, there is adventure ahead of you, there is goodness out ahead of you, and you can put your hand in the hand of God and take hold of life with gusto and live well and live. I mean, that's what Abraham's big story is all about, right? You know it as well as I do. God comes to Abraham and Sarah in their old age. They are kind of on the rocking on the porch in the ranch at Ur of the Chaldees, and God comes to them and say, "Follow where I go to this land that I will show you. You will become parents of a great nation. You will become parents who have descendants that are as numerous as the stars. So that's my promise to you." And then with that promise, God gives another promise that with those descendants, there will be a land that I give you, a place for your descendants to live, the promised land, right? We call it that because it was seen and is to this day seen as the fulfillment of the promise that God had given to Abraham. So, I mean, let's frame all of this in the broad strokes of the larger story of Abraham, which is simply and really unambiguously an uplifting story. God calling an ordinary and unlikely person to a good life and an adventurous life, and then God fulfilling the promise and providing them, Abraham and Sarah, what they need to get out there, live their dreams, and know it is indeed a good and wonderful world when you put your hand in the hand of God. All of us have some sense as to the power of that, I think, or you wouldn't be here today. And one of the things I notice is there is that sense. Since with grandkids now, I mean, our oldest grandson is 5 years old, and I notice how young children instinctively seem to take hold of that promise that Abraham was given. Get out there and live, take hold of life because it's basically good. I mean, that's my shorthand of what I think Abraham's story is about. I see that so clearly in my 5-year-old grandson. Lori and I sometimes, when we have him over, we'll take him to near the city park playground near our house and let him play. There are always kids there, and sometimes they're older kids, sometimes they're younger kids. But what I notice about young children is they have this just genuine sense that they're going to be okay in life, that life's going to be okay. So he'll run up and start visiting with whoever's there, doesn't know them from the man on the moon, and he'll kind of insinuate himself into what play is going on, and before long, They're all off and going. It's just sort of like, I'm sure people are going to love me. I mean, it's just how I can get out there and try it because, sure, people are going to love me. And when I see that, it just reminds me that this deeply inbred assumption that you can take risks in life and it'll make your life richer, that is something that goes all the way back in our ancestry, our genetic makeup, our DNA to Abraham. And he gets word in old age that God is going to give him an adventure, a new son, Isaac, which means laughter in Hebrew, right? Because Sarah had laughed when she got the news that at her advanced age she was going to have a child. Isaac, laughter, will be your son, and you'll go off to be parents of a nation. Now, if I were writing the story of Abraham, I would have stopped there. That would be my preference. An old couple having this child, seeing the promise of God fulfilled, I would have said the end and just left it at that. But unfortunately, nobody consulted me, and the story goes on. And if nothing else, the 22nd chapter of Genesis is a testimony to the fact that though life basically is good, it certainly can turn on you, and it can test you mightily at the times you don't expect, and sometimes it can happen in the blink of an eye. And such is the case for Abraham, right? Things are going well, the promise is being fulfilled, he's taken hold of life, and it's going well, and then wham. Now, after these things, the Lord tested Abraham, saying, "Now take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on a mountain, of which I will show you." And if that's not bad enough, what comes next doesn't make it better. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 servants and Isaac and some wood and a fire pot, and set out. Story says they go for 3 days. Father with a heavy heart, son whom he loves, dutifully following along. And the text, interestingly enough, tells us 3 times, every time he lists Isaac, the one Isaac whom he loved. We hear that over and over, just to kind of make a point about the enormity of what is transpiring here. And on the 3rd day, they get to Mount Moriah, and Abraham and Isaac leave the servants and proceed alone up to the top. And Isaac asks the obvious question: "So where's the lamb, Dad?" And at this point, Abraham offers an answer that turns out to be the key to the story, the key really to the whole business. And you could read it, I guess, as either one of the bravest or the silliest things anybody says in the Old Testament. Where is the lamb? Well, the Lord will provide. And I notice in the story, and you need to notice it too, that that's good enough for Isaac. Okay, all right. He trusts his father, and Abraham trusts God, despite any misgivings he would have had and any doubts he was feeling. He does what he is led to do. Abraham trusts God, and this drama, which is really a terrible drama, it continues right up to the last terrifying moment when the angel does appear, not a second too soon, and God does provide. There is a ram in the thicket, stuck on its horns, the text says. And it's not there by accident, it's there because God put it there. And a collective sigh of relief, obviously, goes up from Abraham and Isaac, and he is released, and the ancient ceremony is performed, and they go home. Nothing is said about their trip home. Do you know? I wonder what in the world would they have said to each other as they made their way home. To this day, the tradition is that the site on which this story unfolded is the very site of the temple in Jerusalem. No longer the site of where human sacrifice is contemplated, but the place that you come and offer yourself as a living sacrifice to a God who keeps his promises and provides, sometimes at the last minute, but provides when the chips are down. Thomas Cahill is an author who some years back wrote a good book entitled The Gifts of the Jews. And it was a helpful little study of some of the more significant contributions to religious thought that came out of ancient Israel and what it has meant since then. And one of the things in his book that I find particularly helpful in thinking about this passage is his reminder that this is, and other stories in Genesis are this way too, obviously, but this one in particular, Cahill says, is among the very oldest of our stories in the Old Testament, the very most ancient in our tradition. Cahill says when you read a story as ancient as this one, written about 1,800 years before Christ, he says you'll get off the track in a hurry if you start comparing the behavior of the people in these very ancient stories with ourselves and with our modern sensibilities, what we have been blessed with in terms of the wisdom that's accumulated over the 4,100 odd years since this passage was written. He says you'll get off the track if you compare the behavior of ancient story characters with our modern sensibilities. Instead, what you need to do is compare their behaviors with the comparative behaviors of other people of their time. For instance, in this case, the clans and tribes of contemporaries 19th century before Christ would be the Sumerians, Sumerians. The Sumerians were a nomadic desert people who lived all around in that world. Mesopotamia, now Iraq and Syria, those early desert contemporaries of Abraham. You can't judge Abraham, Cahill says, by the standards of today. You have to compare him to them, the Hittites and the Babylonians who lived around him. And about them, he says, we do know a few things. He says, if you look at these other civilizations of Abraham's time, instead of being horrified at this story of Genesis 22, you can start to see there is a little something more going on here. There is, for the first time, the emergence of an idea of God that is very different from the idea of God that everybody else was holding at that time. You see, Cahill says, up into this story, everybody of Abraham's contemporaries, they were all polytheists. They believed in many gods. They thought that God resided in amulets and statues. They were kind of like a god of good luck charms. They would wear amulets around their necks. And religion functioned very much as a kind of superstitious good luck charm that would ward off, wild animals or other threats, nature, illness, whatever it might be. But what happens beginning with Abraham is a new understanding of God altogether, not as this impersonal magic force that resides in an amulet or on a little statue, but a personal God who is conscious and who comes down to engage people and talk to them and understands their emotions and enlists their trust and says there's a bigger world for you if only you can see that and only you're willing to take the chance. Abraham's God, Cahill says, and it's interesting to think about, is the first time somebody thinks of God who is not a charm to be worn around the neck, trying to give us comfort from things that we want, but a God who is outside of us and calling us forward, who wants something of us. First time in the history of the world anybody ever thought of God not as a magic force at their disposal, but as a holy other, a holy friend, asking something of them and calling you to give of yourself even when you're not sure of the outcome. Cahill says to read those stories, especially this one, seriously, is to ask, can we open ourselves to a God who we don't fully understand, but who clearly is beyond our amulets and our scheming, who's not all about us, and instead of showering us with trivial rewards, invites us to larger, trust-filled living? Only this God is worth our life, Cahill says. It was worth Isaac's life, and it was worth Abraham's life, because this is the only God there is that's worthy of the name. And I think he's on to something. I really do. Maybe the best way to see this story is for what it taught Abraham and Isaac, and by implication, what it teaches us. And what Abraham and Isaac learned that day is that you really aren't alive until you give yourself away, till you give yourself to some value beyond yourself and live for something, even be willing to die for something that God calls you to. T.S. Eliot was the one who wrote that half the harm in the world, he said, is caused by people who want to feel important. And this story is one of history's earliest records of God calling the human family to understand that the path to receiving a depth of relationship and the provision of God is the path of humility and trust rather than asserting your own ego and striving for the things that you want to get your own way. I'm reminded of a famous story from the life of Muhammad Ali back when he was in robust health and kind of had that swagger that he was famous for. The story is Muhammad Ali was on an airport one day, and before they took off, the flight attendant said to him, "Please fasten your seatbelt, sir." And full of bravado, Ali said, "Hey, darling, Superman don't need no seatbelt." To which she immediately replied, "Well, Superman don't need an airplane either. But I see that you do." Eliot said we all want to feel important, and at times we all want to believe that it's all about us. Our importance is paramount. But Abraham's story turns that on its ear. It's our reminder that ultimately and paradoxically, we find life by letting go. By letting go, even of things that we dearly love, and trusting that as we put our hand in the hand of God, the Lord will provide. I mean, that's how the story ends, right? After all, just those words, the Lord will provide. Abraham catches his breath. He looks around at the top of Mount Moriah, and that's the word that comes from the angel. The Lord will provide. Maybe not the way we want, maybe not in a way that makes sense to us or in the timing we want, but the Lord will provide, often in a way that surprises us most. And that's important to take to heart, because eventually, you know it as well as I do, eventually we're all tested, aren't we? Eventually. We're all tested in a way we never dreamed we might be, in some fashion that strengthens our doubts and causes us to wonder whether God will be there for us at all. Every one of us will have those moments when we ask, can I live now faithfully, that despite all that's going on around me, there will be some power that will help me find a way through. That's the test. And it's not detestable at all. As I tried to be funny in the title, but it's not detestable. It's just the way life goes for all of us. And when the test comes in your life, whatever form it takes, or my life, we all have to ask ourselves, can we let go of self? Can we let go of what we want and say, Lord, here am I, here am I. Deliver me to this deeper place. Make good on this promise that is as old as Genesis. Fear not. Here is the ram. The Lord will provide.